When the Lockheed S-3 Viking first fired up its engines on carrier decks in the mid-1970s, something seemed very wrong. Instead of the thunderous roar expected from a military jet, this submarine hunter produced a sound more familiar from suburban living rooms, the distinctive whine of a vacuum cleaner. As the Cold War intensified through the 1950s, a revolution was taking place beneath the waves. The submarine, once little more than a submersible torpedo boat that spent most of its time on the surface, was transforming into something far more sinister. The catalyst was nuclear power. The United States had pioneered nuclear submarines with USS Nautilus in 1954, but when the Soviet Union launched K-3 Leninsky-Komsomol in 1958, it signaled that America's advantage beneath the waves would not go unchallenged. Unlike the diesel vessels that came before it, this underwater predator could remain submerged indefinitely, racing through the depths at speeds that rendered traditional anti-submarine tactics obsolete. But this was just the beginning. By the mid-1960s, the threat was multiplying rapidly. The Soviets were producing new classes of nuclear submarines at an alarming rate, from hulking November-class boats that could outrun destroyers to Echo-class cruise missile submarines, capable of launching devastating attacks from beyond the horizon. Intelligence analysts predicted hundreds more would follow. U.S. naval strategists quickly realized that their existing anti-submarine aircraft were woefully inadequate. The propeller-driven Grumman S-2 tracker, introduced in 1954, had been designed to hunt slow diesel submarines that spent most of their time on the surface, but the introduction of nuclear vessels was quickly rendering it obsolete. With twin-piston engines that could barely manage 300 miles per hour, limited range, and primitive sensors, it was no match for its new, futuristic targets that rarely emerged above the waves. Furthermore, as carriers became increasingly dominated by jet aircraft, the tracker's need for gasoline rather than jet fuel made it an expensive burden on logistics. America's carriers, the foundation of its naval power, now found themselves vulnerable to an enemy they could barely detect, let alone destroy. It was high time for the emergence of a new submarine hunter, one that was specifically designed to take on the challenges of the nuclear age. In late 1966, after 2 years of careful consideration, the U.S. Navy issued one of the most challenging aircraft requirements of the Cold War. The VSX program, heavier-than-air, anti-submarine, experimental, demanded an aircraft with twice the speed, twice the range, and twice the ceiling of the aging S-2 tracker. Several aircraft manufacturers threw their hats into the ring, but by August 1968, the competition had been whittled down to 2 teams, one led by Lockheed and another by Convair and Grumman. Lockheed had already made a name for itself with the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird, but its experience with naval aviation was limited. Recognizing their inexperience, they partnered with the industrial conglomerate Ling Temco Vought, whose engineers had already mastered the brutal demands of carrier operations with aircraft like the F-8 Crusader and A-7 Corsair II. LTV incorporated many elements of those earlier efforts into the airframe of the new design, such as the landing gear architecture and folding mechanisms. Nonetheless, the result was unlike anything that had flown from a carrier deck before. Twin turbofan engines, a choice rarely seen in naval aviation, would provide the speed and fuel efficiency needed for marathon submarine hunts, while a high-mounted wing would give the aircraft exceptional stability during low-level attacks. At the heart of the new aircraft was perhaps its most revolutionary feature, UNIVAC's general-purpose digital computer. While previous submarine hunters relied on separate instruments and paper traces that required crews to manually calculate intercepts, Lockheed's proposal would fuse radar, sonar, and magnetic sensors through a single computer system. For the first time, a 4-man crew in a carrier-based aircraft would have the same submarine hunting capability as the 12-man crews of land-based P-3 Orions. On August 4, 1969, Lockheed's proposal was crowned the winner of the competition, and 8 prototypes, designated YS-3A, were ordered. However, the company's engineers faced a daunting timeline. The Navy demanded a working prototype within 3 years, an aggressive schedule for such an innovative aircraft. Rather than the traditional approach of building an aircraft and hoping it worked, the Navy implemented a structured series of checkpoints and milestones. Lockheed's previous experience with the troubled C-5 Galaxy, a massive transport that had suffered devastating cost overruns and schedule delays, had taught everyone valuable lessons about keeping complex programs on track. On January 21, 1972, at Lockheed's Palmdale facility, the Viking's revolutionary design concepts would be put to the test. Pilots Chris Christensen and Lyle Schaefer took the YS-3A prototype gracefully into the California sky for a flight that lasted 1 hour, 42 minutes. After landing, Christensen reported, quote, "The aircraft handled beautifully. It was exceptionally stable and very responsive to the controls. I think it'll do everything the Navy expects of it." His confidence proved justified. While the first prototype was damaged during barrier arrest trials at NATF Lakehurst and was later stricken from the inventory with only 184.8 flight hours, flight testing otherwise proceeded with remarkable smoothness. No major design flaws, no catastrophic failures, just steady progress toward operational capability. By November 1973, carrier qualification trials were underway, as test pilots learned to land the jet-powered submarine hunter on pitching carrier decks. During these early flights, it quickly became apparent that the Viking had a very distinctive sound, one that would soon become part of its identity. The TF-34 engines, with their high bypass ratio, designed for fuel efficiency rather than raw power, produced a peculiar vacuum cleaner-like whine that set the aircraft apart from every other jet on the carrier deck. Crews began calling it the Hoover, after the famous vacuum cleaner brand, though some preferred the more military-sounding War Hoover. With testing complete, the humming Predator was ready for action. On February 20th, 1974, the S-3A Viking officially entered U.S. Navy service with Training Squadron VS-41 at NAS North Island, California. The Shamrocks became the first unit to master the complex art of hunting nuclear submarines from a jet aircraft. By modern standards, the Viking development program was an outstanding success, less than 9 years from concept to operational service. The following year, VS-21's Fighting Red Tails took the Viking on its first operational cruise aboard USS John F. Kennedy to the Mediterranean Sea. The aircraft's debut would validate everything Lockheed's engineers had promised. By the end of 1975, Viking squadrons were deployed aboard carriers across both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets. But the Viking's early years were far from smooth sailing. The first problem emerged almost immediately during carrier operations. The aircraft's sophisticated mission computer, the very system that made it so capable, had an alarming tendency to dump its software during the violent shock of catapult-assisted takeoffs. Crews would strap in for a submarine hunting mission, only to find themselves airborne with blank screens and useless sensors, forcing them to restart the entire system in flight and reload the software from scratch. Even more troubling was a bureaucratic failure that would plague the Viking for years. In the post-Vietnam budget cuts, the Navy's spare parts program for the new aircraft became one of the worst affected. By 1977, replacement parts were growing critically short, threatening to ground the entire fleet. The challenge intensified in 1978 when Soviet naval intelligence achieved a breakthrough that would reshape underwater warfare. The Project 617 RTM Victor III, with its revolutionary sound-dampening design, was remarkably quieter than its predecessors. For the first time, Soviet nuclear submarines could approach American carriers without the obvious acoustic signature that had made them vulnerable to detection. The Vikings suddenly faced an enemy that was harder to find and more dangerous than ever before. By 1981, the situation had become a crisis. Just when they were needed most to counter the new generation of Soviet submarines, Viking squadrons often struggled to keep even 40% of their aircraft mission ready. For pilots and crews, the situation was maddening. They'd finally received the most advanced submarine hunting aircraft ever built, only to watch it sit grounded on carrier decks, while increasingly capable Soviet submarines prowled unchallenged. The breakthrough came in 1982, when Navy leadership finally recognized that something needed to be done. A massive procurement program began delivering the components needed to keep the fleet flying, while new maintenance programs focused on increasing aircraft availability. The results were dramatic. Mission readiness climbed to 60% in 1983, then soared to 80% by the mid-1980s, eventually becoming the highest in the fleet. With the spare parts problem at an end, the Viking was finally able to prove its true worth in operations around the world. In 1986, S-3s from VS-28, flying from USS Independence, achieved a remarkable feat, detecting submarines from 8 different countries during a single Mediterranean cruise. Yet even as the Viking showed its effectiveness, the human element remained the most unpredictable factor in the deadly game of submarine hunting. For example, in January 1987, 20-year-old sensor operator Kevin Noonan found himself strapped into the cramped rear compartment of an S-3A over the Mediterranean, monitoring sonobuoys scattered across the sea floor, in a barrier designed to protect USS Nimitz from a prowling Charlie II cruise missile submarine. Through his headphones came the underwater symphony of the ocean, subtle acoustic signatures that might betray a lurking enemy. Then it happened. On one buoy, barely a whisper on his display, Noonan detected what looked like a submarine signature. The contact was weak, fleeting. Fear and inexperience paralyzed the young operator. He said nothing. Hours later, analysis of the mission tapes confirmed it. The brief contact was indeed a Soviet submarine. In response, the 100,000-ton aircraft carrier and her escorts immediately increased speed, racing through the Strait of Sicily faster than originally planned. A moment of self-doubt had affected the movement of an entire battle group. The incident revealed both the Viking's remarkable capability and its fundamental limitation. Sophisticated sensors were only as effective as the humans operating them. This reality drove home the need for even more advanced systems that could reduce the burden on young operators facing split-second decisions under an enormous pressure. Starting in 1987, the majority of S-3As began a comprehensive transformation under the Weapons Systems Improvement Program. The result was the S-3B, an aircraft that looked nearly identical to its predecessor, but packed revolutionary new capabilities beneath its familiar skin. The most visible change was subtle. 2 AL-39 chaff and flare dispensers mounted behind the main landing gear, the only external clue to the aircraft's enhanced systems. The upgrade centerpiece was the new AN/APS-137 inverse synthetic aperture radar, which could do something no previous naval aircraft had achieved: create detailed images of surface targets. Unlike traditional radar that showed only blips on a screen, ISAR could distinguish between different classes of ships, identifying a Knox-class frigate from a merchant vessel at ranges of over 100 miles. For Viking crews, it was like trading in a telescope for a high-definition camera. The acoustic systems received an equally dramatic enhancement. The new UYS-1 Proteus signal processor could monitor 99 sonobuoy frequencies simultaneously, compared to the original 31. More importantly, it shared software and databases with the latest P3C Orion variants, giving Viking crews access to the most advanced submarine acoustic libraries ever compiled. But perhaps the most significant addition was offensive capability. For the first time, the Viking could carry AGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles, transforming it from purely a reconnaissance platform into a strike aircraft capable of engaging enemy surface vessels at standoff ranges. The combination of ISAR imaging and Harpoon missiles meant a single S-3B could locate, identify, and destroy enemy ships without ever coming within range of their defensive weapons. The enhanced capabilities would soon prove their worth in one of the most realistic Cold War exercises ever attempted. In August 1988, Kevin Noonan found himself aboard USS Theodore Roosevelt, part of a massive NATO exercise called Teamwork 88, a realistic simulation of World War III fought in the treacherous acoustic environment of the Norwegian fjords. Here, Vikings faced their greatest challenge yet, hunting quiet diesel submarines in echo-filled waters where normal detection methods became nearly useless. The exercise pushed both aircraft and crews to their limits. During one particularly intense moment, as aircraft launched for an alpha strike, Norwegian F-16s, simulating Soviet fencers, streaked across the carrier deck at wave-top height, releasing practice bombs on the flight deck while Vikings and Tomcats struggled to get airborne. The air boss screamed over the radio for the attacking jets to, quote, "get the hell out of my airspace." But the Norwegian pilots had made their point about realistic training. Meanwhile, the S-3B's new capabilities were beginning to impress even skeptical fleet aviators. During a surface warfare exercise, an S-3B used its ISAR radar to precisely identify and plot enemy warships from over the horizon, then coordinated a devastating Harpoon missile strike. The CO of VA-36, the intruder squadron leading the attack, came to the Viking ready room afterward with a huge smile. Amazed that the crew could identify exact ship classes without ever seeing them visually, he simply declared, quote, "magic." However, the Soviet threat that had given birth to the Viking would soon collapse. As the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989 and the Soviet Union began its final descent toward dissolution, the submarine menace that had dominated naval planning for 2 decades suddenly seemed less pressing. But rather than face retirement like some Cold War weapons, the adaptable Viking discovered an entirely new lease on life, performing roles that its creators had never imagined. During the 1991 Gulf War, 43 S-3Bs deployed aboard 5 aircraft carriers to face an enemy with no submarines at all. Iraq's navy consisted of patrol boats and coastal craft, hardly the nuclear-powered threats the Viking had been designed to hunt. Nevertheless, Flying 1,674 sorties over the Persian Gulf, Vikings demonstrated versatility that surprised even their crews. The majority of missions, 1,043 flights, involved aerial refueling, as the fuel-efficient aircraft kept thirsty fighters and attack jets topped off for extended combat operations. But the Vikings' capabilities extended far beyond tanking duties. Equipped with sophisticated sensors, S-3Bs conducted reconnaissance missions to track Iraq's few remaining naval vessels and mark the locations of mines and shipping channels. Some Vikings even joined the hunt for Iraq's mobile Scud missile launchers, using their sensitive radar and FLIR systems to scan the desert for the elusive targets that threatened coalition forces. The war also revealed the Vikings' talent for improvisation. When carrier air groups couldn't electronically receive their daily air tasking orders from coalition headquarters in Riyadh, an S-3B would be dispatched to pick them up manually. In one creative mission, Vikings delivered reconnaissance photos to ground units by stuffing them into empty sonobuoy tubes and parachuting them to troops, turning submarine detection equipment into an impromptu mail service. Most dramatically, on February 20th, 1991, an S-3B achieved something no other Viking had done. It sank a surface vessel. After dropping 3 Mark 82 bombs on an unidentified Iraqi patrol craft, the Viking crew watched their target disappear beneath the Persian Gulf waters. The submarine hunter had become a ship assassin. As the 1990s progressed, the Viking continued to find itself performing duties outside its traditional submarine hunter profile. The refueling role that had sprung from necessity during the Gulf War would soon become a permanent part of the Vikings' repertoire. When the Navy retired the Ka-6D Intruder tanker aircraft in 1997, the Viking suddenly became the fleet's only dedicated carrier-based refueling platform. The aircraft that had proved it could refuel other jets when needed now had to do so as its primary mission. Equipped with the D-704 Buddy Store, a fuel tank and drogue system mounted under the left wing, the S-3B could transfer thousands of pounds of fuel to thirsty fighters and attack aircraft. During the early phases of the Afghanistan campaign in 2001, Vikings flew continuous refueling sorties to extend the range of fighters operating from carriers in the Arabian Sea, allowing them to reach targets deep inside Afghanistan and return safely to the ship. But aerial refueling was just one of many missions the versatile aircraft could perform. The spacious fuselage and sophisticated sensors made it perfect for electronic warfare, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions. Some Vikings were modified to carry lantern targeting pods, transforming them into precision strike platforms capable of hunting roadside bombs and insurgent activity. The aircraft's adaptability reached its most visible expression on May 1, 2003, when an S-3B bearing the call sign Navy 1 landed President George W. Bush aboard USS Abraham Lincoln off the California coast. Though the carrier was only 30 miles from shore, well within helicopter range, the Navy chose the Viking for its dramatic visual appeal. The honor of carrying the president had undoubtedly been one of the highlights of the S-3's career. But by the following year, the aircraft had been in service for 3 whole decades. The Navy decided it was time to begin executing what it euphemistically called the Sundown Plan, the phased retirement of all Viking squadrons by 2009. Nevertheless, the adaptable aircraft was not done yet. In a final display of the versatility that had defined its career, 13 aging S-3Bs received lantern targeting pods stripped from retiring F-14 Tomcats. These infrared sensors, originally designed to help the mighty Tomcat hunt Soviet bombers in the darkness, now allowed the humble Viking to peer through the desert haze of Iraq, searching for improvised explosive devices and the insurgents who planted them. Video feeds from the lantern pods could be transmitted directly to ground units through new data link systems, turning submarine hunters into guardian angels for troops thousands of miles from any ocean. Having proven its worth one last time, the Viking gradually began to disappear from the skies. Squadron after squadron received their deactivation orders. VS-29 and VS-38 shut down in April 2004. The Japan-based VS-21 fighting Red Tails, the same squadron that had taken the Viking on its first operational cruise aboard USS John F. Kennedy 30 years earlier, flew their final missions in January 2005. The Viking's replacement, the Super Hornet, could perform most of the Viking's missions adequately, if not quite as well. It could carry buddy stores for aerial refueling, drop bombs on surface targets, and conduct reconnaissance missions. What it couldn't do was hunt submarines with the Viking's specialized sensors. But in the mid-2000s, that seemed like a mission the Navy might never need again. Meanwhile, even as squadrons began shutting down, NASA had discovered its own use for the Viking. In 2004, the space agency acquired 4 of the retired aircraft for its Glenn Research Center in Ohio. One, bearing the civilian registration N601NA, was extensively modified for research missions, studying engine icing, testing communication systems for unmanned aircraft, and monitoring algal blooms over the Great Lakes. For more than a decade, N601NA flew almost daily, its blue and white NASA livery a stark contrast to the gray paint it had worn in Navy service. By October 2006, only 30 S-3Bs remained in active service, scattered across the last 4 squadrons. The final operational deployment came in 2008, when BS-22 checkmates took 4 Vikings to Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq's Anbar province. After more than 350 missions, they landed back in NAS Jacksonville on December 15, 2008. On January 29, 2009, BS-22 was decommissioned, marking the end of the S-3's frontline service with the fleet. But the Viking's story still wasn't quite finished. The Naval Air Warfare Center at Point Mugu, California, saw an opportunity in the aircraft's retirement. VX-30 Bloodhounds acquired 3 of the retired Vikings for a vital but unglamorous mission, clearing the Navy's vast Pacific test ranges of ships and aircraft before missile tests could begin. With their extended endurance, sophisticated radar, and spacious cabin for test equipment, the Vikings proved ideal for the role. These aircraft, designed to hunt the most advanced submarines in the world, were now so sensitive that VX-30 pilots observed that they could even detect, quote, schools of dolphins in patches of seaweed. The end of the Vikings' Navy service, when it finally came, arrived quietly. On January 8, 2016, Commander Jim Middag of VX-30's last operational S-3B for a final flight to Arizona. As Bloodhound 700 touched down at Davis Monthan Air Force Base, the legendary Boneyard, where retired military aircraft await an uncertain future, Middag reflected on what the Viking had meant to those who flew it. As he stepped off the aircraft for the final time, he declared, quote, "This is obviously a bittersweet day, not only for me, but for anyone who was a part of the S-3 community. This is likely the last time I will ever fly that airplane, but somehow I'm hoping that I'm actually not the last pilot to fly the plane. We're all hopeful that Bloodhound 700 flies again somewhere." His hope wasn't entirely misplaced. For several years, South Korea had shown serious interest in purchasing up to 36 refurbished Vikings to hunt North Korea's growing submarine fleet. The proposal made strategic sense. The aircraft retained thousands of flight hours of service life, having flown only 10,000 hours out of a potential 23,000. But in 2017, Seoul ultimately chose the much larger P-8 Poseidon instead, and the Viking revival quietly disappeared. NASA's N601NA soldiered on alone, the last flying representative of an entire generation of naval aviation. But even that final chapter drew to a close on July 13, 2021, when the space agency retired its last Viking after 17 years of faithful service. The aircraft that had begun life hunting Soviet submarines ended its career contributing to science, a fitting testament to the adaptability that had defined the type throughout its remarkable run. Today, hundreds of S-3 Vikings sit in storage rows at Davis Monthan, their distinctive high wings and twin engines creating geometric patterns in the Arizona desert. Inspections have confirmed what Commander Middag said. They remain in exceptional condition, their airframes barely middle-aged by aviation standards. Yet they sleep on, victims not of wear or obsolescence, but of budget constraints and the Navy's preference for operating fewer aircraft types. Some analysts argue the Navy made a strategic error in retiring the Viking. As China's military grows more capable and submarines proliferate across the Pacific, the limitations of short-range carrier aircraft have become increasingly apparent. The Super Hornet, for all its capabilities, has roughly half the combat radius of the Viking. In an era where enemy missiles can threaten carriers at ever greater distances, the Viking's range and endurance suddenly seem prescient rather than obsolete. Captain Derek "Fluff" Martin, who flew one of the last Vikings to retirement at the Air Zoo in Michigan, summed up what the community had lost, saying, quote, "Largely unknown and unheralded, she was a jack-of-all-trades, master of none kind of jet that outlasted both the A-7 and the F-14 in the carrier air wing." Perhaps that versatility, the very quality that made the Viking so valuable for 35 years, also sealed its fate. In an age of specialization and budget constraints, there was no room for an aircraft that could do many things well when others could do a few things slightly better. The Swiss Army knife of naval aviation had finally been put away, its many tools no longer needed, by a Navy confident that simpler instruments would suffice.